The wilderness doesn't give second chances. When Daniel Shaw and his longtime hunting partner Ethan Barnes set out on an elk hunt near Yellowstone National Park, they knew the risks. But no amount of preparation could have fully braced them for the moment a massive grizzly bear came tearing through the trees, intent on ripping them apart. It happened in an instant. A deep, guttural growl shattered the silence, and before either of them could react, a 600-pound bear was already charging. In September 2021, Daniel and Ethan arrived in Wyoming, excited for the elk hunt of a lifetime. The two had been hunting together for years, but this trip was special. Daniel had drawn a rare elk tag for a unit just outside of Yellowstone, and he wasn't about to waste the opportunity. The South Dakota native had fallen in love with elk hunting back in 2016. An arborist by trade and a dedicated family man, Daniel was the type of person who split his time between work, hunting, and preparing for the next big adventure. After years of hunting deer and other game, he set his sights on elk, traveling to Colorado year after year until he finally took down his first bull. That moment sealed his obsession. Elk hunting was in his blood, but hunting in Wyoming meant dealing with more than just elk. Everyone knew this was grizzly country, and Daniel was well aware of the risks. That's why he spent months preparing. When he found out he'd drawn the tag, Daniel didn't waste any time choosing the right weapon for the trip. He settled on a Remington 700, a powerful, accurate gun that packed enough punch to drop an elk, or, if necessary, defend against a grizzly. He had considered carrying a sidearm as well, but figured his rifle would be his best chance if he ever had to face off with a predator. Daniel knew that simply owning a rifle wasn't enough. If he was going to depend on it in a life or death situation, he had to train like his life depended on it. Every day he practiced drawing, aiming, and firing as quickly as possible. He drilled scenarios where he was caught off guard, simulating the sudden chaos of an ambush. By the time September arrived, he was as ready as he could be. The first day of the hunt was uneventful. Despite the stunning landscape of Wyoming's rugged wilderness, elk were proving elusive. Daniel had taken a shot at a bull, but it escaped into the thick timber. The following day, the two hunters climbed higher, hoping for better luck. They weren't alone. As they pushed through dense timber, they noticed fresh bear sign, huge claw marks on trees, turned over logs, and fresh scat. They were in grizzly territory, and that meant they had to be on high alert. Then came the noise, a violent rustling in the trees ahead, followed by a roar that shook them to their core. Daniel and Ethan instinctively shouted, "Bear!" Before Daniel could fully process what was happening, a massive grizzly exploded from the brush. He barely had time to react before the beast was nearly on top of him. With his rifle already in hand, his instincts took over. Daniel squeezed the trigger. The first shot rang out, kicking up dirt just in front of the bear. It didn't even slow down. Realizing this was no bluff charge, he fired again. The bear flinched but kept coming. By the time he fired his fifth shot, Daniel was falling backward. Ethan had been just behind Daniel when the attack began. As soon as he saw the bear charging, he pulled out his bear spray and unleashed a cloud of burning mist into the air. But the wind had different plans. The spray blew straight back into Ethan's face, blinding him instantly. He stumbled back, coughing and gagging. Still, despite the burning in his eyes, he didn't hesitate. He lifted his own rifle and fired twice into the charging bear. Daniel, now on the ground, realized that his foot was in the way of his next shot. He had seconds to adjust before the bear was on him. Twisting his body, he steadied the .365 Winchester, aimed, and fired his seventh shot. The bear, now bleeding heavily, dropped onto all fours and prepared for one last lunge. Then, suddenly, it stopped. Ethan's final shot had hit it square in the chest. The massive grizzly turned, staggered, and lumbered back toward the trees. The two men yelled at the bear, trying to scare it off. It sat back on its haunches 90 yards away, watching them. Daniel fired another shot, striking it in the hindquarters. Finally, the grizzly disappeared into the trees. Daniel and Ethan immediately radioed authorities, reporting the attack. Game wardens arrived shortly after and tracked the bear, finding its body deep in the forest. Upon investigation, they discovered something heartbreaking. The bear was a female with a cub. The cub's tracks were nearby, meaning the mother had likely been in defense mode when she attacked. Without her, the cub had little chance of survival. Daniel felt a pang of guilt, but he also knew there had been no other choice. If he hadn't reacted as quickly as he did, neither of them would have survived. The authorities ruled the shooting self-defense, acknowledging that Daniel's quick reflexes had saved his life. Sitting by the fire that night, Daniel reflected on what had just happened. He had trained for this moment, but nothing could have truly prepared him for staring death in the face. His Remington 700 had held its ground, but it had taken 7 shots to stop the bear. That was a hard lesson about the sheer toughness of these animals. Would he return to the wilderness? Absolutely. But next time, he'd be even more prepared. Because in the wild, second chances don't come easy. Surviving an attack from an enraged bear is an incredibly difficult task, even if you're properly equipped. When Lee Francis found himself facing off with a massive grizzly, he quickly pulled out his 10mm Glock pistol, thinking it would help him defend himself. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work as he had hoped. Sometimes, even with the best preparation, things don't go as planned. It was Friday, October 21st, 2022, when Lee Francis and his son set out for an elk hunt. At 65 years old, Lee, a dentist by profession, and his son Josh, also a dentist, were far from novices. In fact, they were seasoned hunters with years of experience. Armed with years of hunting experience and the excitement of the trip ahead, Lee and his son started their elk hunt with confidence. They were well prepared, knowing the risks involved. In fact, they had already faced some frightening encounters. Just a month earlier, during a bow hunting trip in September, they had a close call with not one, but 2 curious bears. The first bear had approached them, but they managed to drive it off by making noise with sticks. After the first bear retreated, they thought the danger was over. But shortly after, another bear wandered into their camp, startling their horses. The 2 bear encounters in such a short period made Lee realize the importance of taking extra precautions. Lee had always trusted his bow for hunting, but after those bear encounters, he felt the need for something more powerful for protection. So he bought a handgun to carry with him on future trips, believing it would provide an extra layer of safety if things ever took a dangerous turn. It was a decision that would seem logical to anyone venturing into the wild. On October 21st, 2022, Lee Francis and his son chose the Rock Creek region in Sublette County, Wyoming, as their hunting destination. Located south of Grand Teton National Park, this area is part of the larger Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The region is brimming with wildlife, from thousands of plant species to hundreds of bird species and numerous mammal species. It also hosts fish, reptiles, and amphibians, making it a true natural wonder. The list of animals living in Sublette County is vast, including elk, moose, mule deer, pygmy rabbits, bald eagles, wolves, grizzly bears, and many others. The land itself is ancient, with evidence suggesting that humans have been utilizing its resources for at least 11,000 years. While our methods for acquiring food, shelter, and clothing have evolved over time, hunting remains a practice for many who feel a deep connection to their ancestral roots. For these individuals, hunting is not just a pastime, but a fundamental human tradition. Lee Francis and his son were part of this group. When they set out on their hunting trip in October 2022, They had no idea that their fears of a bear encounter would soon turn into a terrifying reality, one that would nearly cost them everything. The pair, accompanied by at least one horse, were on the lookout for elk. At one point during their hunt, they decided to split up in order to cover a larger area, though they kept close enough to maintain contact. That evening, 65-year-old Lee Francis was walking through the terrain, focused on finding elk. He was so absorbed in his task that he didn't notice how close he had come to a bear's cave. It was an accidental discovery, and by the time Lee realized his mistake, the situation had already begun to spiral into a life-threatening ordeal. Lee Francis glanced around, his heart pounding as he realized just how close he was to the cave. Bears are drawn to caves for many reasons, especially as safe, secluded spots where they can hibernate or give birth to their cubs. As he surveyed his surroundings, Francis's eyes locked onto something that stopped him in his tracks: a massive grizzly bear. Time seemed to freeze for a brief moment. The creature was enormous, a true force of nature, likely weighing around 700 pounds and standing at least 8 feet tall. It was an awe-inspiring sight. In that split second, Lee knew that his window of opportunity to defend himself was rapidly closing. The animal's proximity left him with little time to think, and it felt like the bear's charge was inevitable. The moment to act was now, or never. The grizzly's eyes were full of fury, and it was coming straight at him. At 65 years old, Lee Francis had no choice but to fight back. He quickly pulled out his pistol, the one he had purchased for situations just like this. He fired, hoping to stop the bear in its tracks, but the shot had little effect. The grizzly, undeterred, kept coming at him with terrifying speed, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground beneath them. Lee had only moments before he would be overwhelmed. The bear's charging pace meant he was now the target, and his chances of survival depended on quick thinking and sheer willpower. In a moment of panic, Lee accidentally startled the bear, which only made matters worse. Bears, known for their aggression when surprised, became even more dangerous in these situations. In an instant, Francis found himself on his back, vulnerable and exposed to the grizzly's powerful jaws and razor-sharp claws. With the massive creature just inches from him, Lee fought with everything he had, kicking desperately to push the bear away. In that frantic moment, Lee's pistol finally made an impact, but not in the way he had intended. As his foot collided with the bear's skull, he fired once more. The chaos of the situation, combined with his erratic movements, caused his aim to go awry. Instead of shooting the bear, Francis accidentally shot himself in the leg. The pain was intense, but when he saw that the grizzly was retreating, he likely considered it a small price to pay. The sound of the shot, along with the pain it inflicted, scared the bear enough to make it flee. The huge grizzly ran off, leaving Francis wounded but alive. The bear's departure gave him a fleeting moment of relief, but now he needed medical help fast. His injuries, both from the bear's proximity and the self-inflicted gunshot wound, meant that time was running out. But Lee Francis, still shaken from the harrowing encounter, was thankful to have survived the deadly encounter. Josh Francis quickly rushed to his father's side, finding him injured and in shock, bleeding on the ground. Once his father was stable enough, Josh used a satellite phone to call for emergency assistance. It was just before 6 p.m. The father and son made their way towards Water Dog Lake, a nearby spot where rescue teams were prepared to meet them. They were transferred to an air ambulance waiting to fly Lee to the University of Utah Hospital in Salt Lake City. At the hospital, Lee Francis underwent 2 surgeries on his lower leg. Unfortunately, wildlife officials were unable to track down the grizzly, as snowstorms had hindered visibility. They planned to resume their search the following Monday. When reflecting on his terrifying experience with the giant bear, Lee admitted that while he had encountered large bears before, nothing could have prepared him for the sheer intensity of being charged. Although he was physically recovering from his injuries, the emotional scars remained. "I'm sure I'll have a nightmare or two the next time I'm out in the mountains," he confessed to reporters. Lee also shared some advice with others. Always carry bear protection. Bear attacks can happen in an instant.